Picture, if you will, the ancient world at dusk. Somewhere on a dusty battlefield in the Peloponnese, two armies face each other across a stretch of trampled wheat. The bronze of their shields catches the last orange light of the sun, and, somewhere unseen, but felt in the pit of every soldier's stomach, a presence moves between the ranks. The Greeks had a name for that presence. They called him ARES. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow, because today we are going to walk together through the mountains, the battlefields, and the divine courts of ancient Greece, in search of one of mythology's most misunderstood figures. Not a villain, not simply a brute, but something far more complicated. We are going to meet the god of war himself. To the Greeks, Ares was the son of Zeus, king of the gods, and Hera, queen of Olympus. You might expect that lineage to make him beloved, the golden child of the two most powerful deities in the pantheon. And yet, curiously, of all the Olympians, Ares was perhaps the least adored by his own family. Zeus, in the Iliad, looks upon his own son and tells him plainly that he is the most hateful god on Olympus. Strong words from a father, but to understand why, we have to understand what Ares actually represented. You see, the Greeks were a people who knew war intimately. It was not an abstraction to them. It was harvest season interrupted. It was sons who did not come home. It was cities burned and rebuilt and burned again. And so they split the concept of warfare into two distinct divine forces. There was Athena, goddess of strategic warfare, of wisdom, of the calculated maneuver and the righteous cause. And then there was Ares. Ares was not strategy. Ares was not honor. Ares was the raw, chaotic, bloodthirsty fury of battle itself. The screaming, the carnage, the madness that takes hold of men when swords are drawn and reason disappears. Where Athena was war as the mind understood it, Ares was war as the body felt it. This is why, when Athena and Ares meet on the battlefield in Homer's great epic, it is Athena who triumphs, not because she is stronger, but because the Greeks believed that wisdom, in the end, should overpower blind savagery. It's a lovely piece of moral architecture hidden inside a myth, isn't it? Even the gods understood that strength without thought is a dangerous, unstable thing. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. But let us not mistake Ares for a weakling, because nothing could be further from the truth. In raw physical power, Ares had few equals. He was enormous. His presence on the fields had to make even seasoned warriors tremble. He rode into battle alongside his sons, Phobos and Deimos, whose names mean fear and dread, and his sister Eris, goddess of discord, trailed close behind, sowing chaos wherever Ares went. His very arrival on a battlefield was said to be enough to tip the balance of a war. His bloodlust so consuming that, in some tellings, he did not even care which side he favored. So long as blood was spilled and the field rang with violence, he simply loved the fight itself. And yet, fascinatingly, Ares was not undefeated. He was wounded by mortal heroes, humiliated in the halls of Olympus, caught in embarrassing scandal with Aphrodite, goddess of love, a relationship that produced children of remarkable consequence, including Harmonia, whose very name suggests the strange balance struck between love and war. He was, despite his terrifying power, a deeply flawed figure, prideful, quick to anger, easily wounded both in body and ego. The Greeks did not worship him so much as they respected him, feared him, and tried, whenever possible, to keep him at arm's length. So who was Ares really? A god of senseless brutality, a necessary force in a violent world, a cautionary tale about strength untempered by wisdom. As we move through this documentary together, we'll explore his origins, his most famous myths, his peculiar place in the city of Sparta, where he was honored above all other gods, his tumultuous love affair with Aphrodite, and the lasting legacy he left behind. A legacy that still shapes the way we think about war, conflict, and the dark allure of violence itself. Take a breath. Let the world soften around you. Our journey into the realm of Ares begins now. Let us begin, as all good stories do, at the beginning. To understand Ares, we must travel back to the marriage of Zeus and Hera, a union that was, even by the standards of Greek mythology, remarkably fraught. Theirs was not a quiet partnership. Zeus, king of the gods, was infamous for his wandering eye, and Hera, for all her power and dignity as Queen of Olympus, spent much of her divine existence in a state of simmering, dignified fury. It was into this household, charged with tension and pride, that Ares was born. Some ancient sources tell us that Ares came into being through the ordinary union of Zeus and Hera, a true child of both king and queen, but other, older traditions offer something stranger and more telling. In these accounts, Hera, resentful of Zeus for birthing Athena from his own head without her involvement, sought out a magical herb, and through it, conceived Ares entirely on her own, without Zeus playing any part at all. Whether or not you find this version persuasive, there's something poetic in it. Even his very birth, in some tellings, is wrapped in discord, in rivalry, in two divine parents working against, rather than with one another. It's almost as if the seeds of conflict were planted before Ares ever drew his first breath. Now, take a moment to imagine the nursery of Olympus, if such a thing existed. Most of the Olympian children grew into their domains gracefully. Apollo with his lyre and his light, Artemis with her bow and her wild forests, Hermes with his quick wit and quicker feet. But Ares, from a young age, was different. He was not interested in music or healing or the gentle arts. He was drawn, almost magnetically, toward conflict, toward the clash of bronze, toward the visceral thrill of combat. Ancient writers describe him as towering, immensely strong, his temperament hot and his patience thin. He did not simply enjoy war. He embodied it in all its glory and all its horror. It's worth pausing here to notice something important about how the Greeks structured their pantheon. Nearly every god and goddess represented a duality, a light and a dark side to their domain. Aphrodite was love, yes, but also the dangerous obsession love can become. Dionysus was joyful revelry, but also madness and destruction. And Ares, true to this pattern, embodied both the necessary courage that allows a society to defend itself, and the uncontrollable bloodlust that can consume a person entirely once violence begins. The Greeks were not naive about war. They knew it was sometimes necessary. A shield against invasion, a means of protecting one's home and family. But they also knew, intimately, its terrible cost. Ares carried both of these truths within him, which is precisely why he was such an uncomfortable figure to worship. To honor Ares was to acknowledge something uncomfortable about human nature itself, that violence, however terrible, has its place in the world, and that there is, undeniably, a kind of dark thrill in it. Let us speak now of where Ares made his home. Unlike many of the Olympians who were closely associated with specific Greek city-states that adored them, Athens with Athena, for instance, Ares found his truest devotion not in the famously cultured cities of classical Greece, but to the north, in the rugged, less hospitable region of Thrace. The Thracians were considered by other Greeks to be fierce, untamed, and warlike, a frontier people living on the edges of what the Greeks considered civilized society. It was fitting, in a way, that the god of war's spiritual homeland would be a place defined by fighting, raiding, and the harsh realities of border life. Even Homer, when describing Ares, often calls him the Thracian, or associates him with that wild northern landscape, reinforcing the sense that Ares was, in some ways, an outsider, even among his own family. Untamed, unrefined, more comfortable on a blood-soaked field than in the polished marble halls of Olympus. This brings us to an important and often overlooked aspect of Ares, his relationship with his fellow gods, which was, to put it gently, complicated. We touched briefly in our introduction on Zeus's harsh words toward his own son. But let's sit with that moment a little longer because it tells us so much. In Book 5 of the Iliad, after Ares has been wounded and comes crying to his father, Zeus glowers down at him and tells him that of all the gods who dwell on Olympus, Ares is the most hateful to him. He goes on to say that strife, war, and battle are the only things Ares ever delights in. It's a brutal thing for a father to say to his son, and yet Zeus does not banish him, does not strip him of his godhood. Why? Because, troublesome as he is, Ares is necessary. War is woven into the fabric of mortal existence, and so the god who represents it cannot simply be discarded, however uncomfortable his presence might be. The other Olympians, too, largely kept Ares at a careful distance. Athena, as we've discussed, frequently opposed him directly, viewing his reckless approach to combat as inferior to her own strategic mind. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, and, in many versions of the myths, the husband of Aphrodite, held a particular grudge against Ares, for reasons we will explore in detail in a later segment concerning that infamous love affair. Even among gods who didn't actively dislike him, there was a sense of wariness, the way you might feel toward a powerful but unpredictable force of nature. You respect the storm. You don't necessarily invite it to dinner. And yet, and this is important, Ares was not without his admirers. Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, was famously drawn to him, finding in his raw power and intensity something irresistible, despite already being married to the steady, hard-working Hephaestus. We see in this an old and enduring pattern that humans have recognized in their own lives for thousands of years: the magnetic, dangerous pull between love and violence, between tenderness and aggression, between the soft and the sharp. Their relationship would produce children whose names and natures reflected this strange union, and we will spend considerable time later in our journey unpacking that fascinating and scandalous chapter of Ares' story. It's also worth noting, gently, that Ares rarely walked into battle alone. He was accompanied, in many myths, by a kind of grim entourage. His sons Phobos and Deimos, whose names translate to fear and dread, rode at his side or drove his chariot, while Eris, the goddess of discord and rivalry, moved through the ranks of soldiers, stirring up chaos and resentment wherever she passed. Even Enyo, a fierce goddess of war and bloodshed in her own right, was said to walk beside him on the battlefield, delighting alongside him in the destruction of cities. Picture this procession for a moment. Fear, dread, discord, and devastation, all walking in step with the god of war himself. It's a vivid, almost cinematic image, isn't it? Ares did not merely cause war. He arrived with an entire ecosystem of violence trailing in his wake, each force feeding into the next, fear breeding dread, dread breeding chaos, chaos breeding bloodshed. As we move forward into the next chapter of our story, we'll explore some of the most famous myths involving Ares directly. His battles with mortal heroes, his humiliating defeats, and the surprising ways in which even a god of his immense power could be outmaneuvered, embarrassed, and even wounded. For now, let this image settle in your mind. A god born, in some tellings, from spite itself, raised on the rugged frontier of Thrace, loved by few, respected by many, and feared by nearly everyone who ever stood across a battlefield from him. Let's continue our journey, slowly, calmly, into the myths that made him legend. Settle back in, and let your mind drift once more to the dust and bronze of ancient battlefields. Because in this segment, we turn to the stories themselves. The myths that ancient Greeks told one another around hearth fires and in the shaded colonnades of their cities. Stories that reveal a strange and rather wonderful truth, that even the god of war himself could be humbled. Let's begin with perhaps the most famous of all these tales, drawn from Homer's Iliad, set during the long and grinding Trojan War. As you may already sense, this war was something of a divine proxy battle as much as a mortal one, with the gods themselves choosing sides and meddling, sometimes recklessly, in the affairs of men. Ares, true to his chaotic nature, fought for the Trojans, while Athena, ever the strategist, backed the Greeks. And in one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire epic, these two siblings, war's fury and war's wisdom, come into direct and devastating conflict. The mortal hero at the center of this tale is Diomedes, king of Argos, a warrior of extraordinary courage even by the heightened standards of Homeric heroes. Diomedes had been granted a rare gift by Athena herself, the ability to see the gods clearly on the battlefield, to recognize divine presence even when disguised in mortal form. Armed with this insight and with Athena's blessing, Diomedes did something almost unthinkable. He raised his spear against Ares. Picture this scene for a moment and let it unfold slowly in your imagination. The battlefield is chaos, the air thick with dust and the cries of dying men. Ares, towering and terrible, fights alongside the Trojans, reveling in the carnage as he always does. And then Diomedes, guided by Athena's own hand upon his weapon, drives his spear forward into the belly of the god of war himself. What happens next is one of the most vivid and almost comedic moments in all of Greek epic poetry. Ares, struck by mortal bronze guided by divine will, lets out a scream so loud, so monstrous, that Homer tells us it sounded like the combined battle cry of 9 or even 10,000 men. The very armies on both sides of the battlefield freeze in terror at the sound. Ares, the embodiment of war's fury, the towering terror of every battlefield he ever graced, flees upward to Olympus in pain, blood pouring from his wound, crying to his father Zeus for sympathy. And this is where we return to that moment we touched upon earlier. Zeus, looking down at his wounded, weeping son, offering not comfort, but contempt. He tells Ares that he is the most hateful of all the gods to him, that he takes after his mother Hera in his quarrelsome nature, and that if Ares were not his own blood, he would have long ago been cast down to dwell even lower than the Titans themselves. It's a startling, almost cruel moment, and yet it tells us so much about how the Greeks understood war itself. Even the king of the gods, even the most powerful being in the cosmos, viewed unrestrained violence with a kind of weary disdain. Necessary, perhaps. Useful, even, but never something to be admired for its own sake. This was not the only time Ares found himself humiliated, despite his immense physical power. Let us turn now to another tale, stranger still, involving two giant brothers known as the Allidae, Otus and Ephialtes. These were no ordinary giants. Ancient sources describe them as growing at a supernatural rate, reaching enormous size and strength while still impossibly young, and harboring ambitions so vast they dared to dream of overthrowing the Olympian gods entirely. In their campaign of cosmic rebellion, the twin giants captured Ares, the supposed unstoppable force of battle, and did something almost unthinkable. They bound him in heavy bronze chains and sealed him inside a massive bronze jar, leaving him trapped there, helpless and humiliated, for an astonishing 13 months. Sit with that image for a moment. The god of war, mighty enough to make 10,000 men scream in unison, was rendered utterly powerless, locked away in a container like some forgotten piece of pottery in a dusty cellar. He remained there, forgotten and fading, until Hermes, the swift messenger god, learned of his plight, quite by accident, through the stepmother of the giants, and came to free him, weak and diminished from his long imprisonment. Why does this story matter? Why did the Greeks tell it, generation after generation? I think it speaks to something deeply human about how we understand power. The Greeks were not interested in gods who were simply, boringly invincible. They wanted their deities to reflect the complicated, contradictory nature of the world itself. And what could be more relatable, more strangely comforting, than the idea that even the most fearsome force in existence could be outwitted, trapped, and rendered powerless by cleverness rather than strength? It is, in its own way, a quiet philosophical statement that brute force, however terrifying, is never truly invincible. There is always a weakness. There is always a jar waiting to be sealed. Now let us turn to a myth that reveals another dimension of Ares entirely, not his battlefield fury, but his capacity for fierce, protective love. This is the story of Ares and his daughter Alcippe. According to the myth, Poseidon's son Halorotheus attempted to assault Alcippe, and Ares, upon discovering this, killed the assailant in a fit of paternal rage and vengeance. This act brought Ares before a tribunal of the gods, accused of murder, and the trial was said to take place on a rocky hill in Athens, a hill which, ever after, bore his name, the Areopagus, meaning the hill of Ares. Remarkably, Ares was acquitted, the gods recognizing his act as one of justified protection rather than senseless violence. This myth gives us a softer glimpse of Ares, doesn't it? A father's fury, channeled not toward chaos for its own sake, but toward the defense of someone he loved. The Areopagus itself would go on to become one of the most important legal and judicial sites in ancient Athens, used for centuries afterward to try cases of serious crime. A fascinating piece of mythology, leading directly into the practical, civic life of the ancient Greeks. We should also pause to mention the myth of the Spartoi, or sown men, which connects Ares to the founding of the great city of Thebes. According to legend, the hero Cadmus, seeking to found a new city, was required to slay a fearsome dragon that happened to be sacred to Ares, guarding a nearby spring. Cadmus succeeded, but in doing so, incurred the god's wrath. Athena, intervening as she so often did in matters involving Ares, instructed Cadmus to sow the dragon's teeth into the earth. From these planted teeth sprang fully armed warriors, who immediately began fighting one another in a frenzy, until only 5 remained alive. These 5 survivors became the ancestors of the noble families of Thebes, and Cadmus himself, to appease the angry Ares for the death of his sacred dragon, was made to serve the god for a period of 8 years. Eventually, the matter was settled, and remarkably, Cadmus would go on to marry Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, uniting, quite literally, the bloodline of the city's founder with the lineage of the war god himself. What strikes me most, as we move through these stories together, is how often Ares appears not as an unstoppable force, but as a deeply flawed, sometimes pitiable figure, wounded by mortals with divine help, imprisoned by ambitious giants, put on trial by his fellow gods, and forced into servitude to atone for his anger. And yet, woven through all of this, there remains an undeniable respect for what he represents. War, the Greeks understood, could not simply be wished away or ignored. It needed a god, it needed a face, and that face, terrifying and flawed as it was, belonged to Ares. In our next segment, we'll turn to a very different side of this complicated deity, his tempestuous, scandalous love affair with Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, and the remarkable trap laid by her husband Hephaestus that would become one of the most retold comedic tales in all of Greek mythology. Take a breath. Let the tension of these battlefields ease from your shoulders. We'll meet again, soon, in the golden halls of Olympus. There is a particular kind of story that transcends its time and place, that travels across centuries and cultures and arrives, still warm, still recognizable, into the present day, a story of forbidden love, wounded pride, and the very human comedy of being caught in precisely the situation you most desperately wish to keep secret. The Greeks told this story about their god of war, and they told it with unmistakable relish. Let us settle in, then, and visit the golden halls of Olympus at their most intimate and their most scandalous, because in this segment we are going to talk about Ares and Aphrodite, arguably the most compelling relationship in all of Greek mythology, and the extraordinary, humiliating trap that brought their secret crashing into the open in front of every god on Olympus. To understand the story, we first need to understand the marriage it was threatening. Aphrodite, goddess of love, beauty, and desire, had been given in marriage to Hephaestus, the divine blacksmith, god of fire and the forge. Now, Hephaestus was brilliant, unquestionably, undeniably brilliant. He crafted the palaces of the gods, forged the armor of Achilles, built golden automatons that walked and worked of their own accord. He was, in the truest sense, the most talented artisan in all of existence. But he was also lame, scarred, and by most ancient descriptions, plain in appearance. A remarkable contrast to the radiant golden goddess he had been given as a wife. How exactly this marriage came to be varies depending on which ancient source you consult, but the general picture is one of a deeply mismatched union. Aphrodite, the embodiment of beauty and desire, bound in marriage to a god she had not chosen and could not love in the way a wife might hope to love a husband. Into this delicate domestic arrangement stepped Ares, tall, powerful, blazing with the fierce energy of the battlefield. Everything that Hephaestus, in physical terms, was not. The attraction between Ares and Aphrodite in the mythology seems almost inevitable, the way certain forces in nature simply move toward one another, regardless of the obstacles placed between them. Their affair was not brief or casual. By some ancient accounts, it was a deep and lasting entanglement, one that would produce multiple children, Phobos, Deimos, Harmonia, and in some tellings, Eros himself, the god of love, whose parentage was always somewhat contested in the ancient sources. Whether or not Eros was their son, the union between the god of war and the goddess of love clearly ran deep. Its roots tangled through both divine genealogy and the poetic imagination of the Greek world. For a time, the affair remained hidden. The lovers were careful, or believed themselves to be, but the gods of Olympus existed in a world with very little true privacy, and it was Helios, the god of the sun, whose chariot swept across the entire sky each day, who saw everything that transpired beneath him, who noticed the two of them together and carried the information directly to Hephaestus. One can imagine the moment Hephaestus received this news. Not rage, exactly, though surely that was present too, but calculation. Because Hephaestus, above all things, was a craftsman, and a craftsman, when confronted with a problem, does not simply react. He builds a solution. What Hephaestus constructed next was, by any measure, a masterpiece of engineering driven by wounded pride. He fashioned a net not from rope or cord, but from fine, impossibly thin bronze links, worked to a delicacy that made them nearly invisible to the naked eye, yet stronger than any chain. He draped this net invisibly over his marriage bed, suspending it in place with such precision that it would collapse and bind around anything that came to rest there, triggered by nothing more than pressure and weight. Then, with the casual announcement that he was traveling away for a time, Hephaestus left his home. Ares and Aphrodite, believing themselves unwatched and free, came together in Hephaestus's own bed. The net fell, and they found themselves caught, tangled, immobilized, unable to separate, held fast by bronze so fine they could barely see it, and so strong they could not break it. Two gods rendered completely helpless by the quiet genius of the craftsman they had underestimated. Hephaestus returned, and rather than free them quietly, rather than resolve the situation with any degree of discretion, he did something that speaks volumes about the particular flavor of divine pride in Greek mythology. He called the gods to come and witness. He threw open the scene to his fellow Olympians, inviting them to look upon what had been done to him and to see for themselves the lovers caught in their betrayal. He wanted witnesses. He wanted acknowledgement of the wrong done to him. He wanted, in some deeply human way, for everyone to know. The male gods came to look. The goddesses, ancient sources tell us, remained absent. Some ancient writers suggest out of modesty, others perhaps because they understood that humiliation of this kind required a certain mercy of privacy. The male gods apparently did not feel inclined to offer, and the male gods, upon seeing the scene, Ares, the terrifying war god, and Aphrodite, the radiant goddess of beauty, trapped together in that fine invisible net, responded in the way that humans have responded to awkward public spectacle for as long as stories have been told. They laughed. Apollo turned to Hermes, the quick and irreverent messenger god, and asked him, in the spirit of the joke, whether he would still choose to be in Ares's position, trapped, humiliated, on display before all of Olympus, if it meant lying beside Aphrodite. Hermes, quick as ever, replied that he would gladly accept 3 times as many chains and let all the goddesses watch too, if it meant the same opportunity. The laughter grew. The scene, for all its cruelty toward those caught in it, had become pure comedy, the kind that gets retold and embellished with every passing year. Eventually, Poseidon, god of the sea, interceded, negotiating on Ares's behalf and promising Hephaestus that justice would be served and the debt paid. Hephaestus released them. Ares, freed at last, returned immediately to Thrace, his homeland, that wild northern territory where he felt most himself, most at ease, while Aphrodite slipped away to her sacred island of Cyprus to recover her composure and her beauty in familiar surroundings. Now, what do we make of all this? It would be easy to read this story purely as comedy, a piece of divine gossip preserved in amber for 2,500 years. And it is funny, genuinely, in the way that only the Greeks could make a story about betrayal and humiliation feel light and almost affectionate. But there are deeper currents running beneath the laughter. Consider for a moment what this story is actually exploring. War and love have always existed in uncomfortable proximity in human experience. They share a certain intensity, a certain all-consuming quality that ordinary life rarely matches. They both demand everything from a person. They both leave marks that do not easily fade. The Greeks, by pairing Ares and Aphrodite in this deeply intimate and enduring relationship, were acknowledging something true about the texture of human experience, that love and violence are not opposites so much as neighbors, forever leaning against the same wall. There is also something quietly significant in the detail that it is the craftsman, the thinker, the maker, who defeats the warrior. Not through combat, not through power or force or divine fury, through patience, through ingenuity, through the quiet construction of something elegant and invisible. Hephaestus does not fight Ares, he traps him. It is a victory of mind over muscle, of craft over combat. And the Greeks, who prized intellectual achievement alongside physical courage, embedded this moral into their most scandalous divine story with characteristic elegance. The children born of Ares and Aphrodite's union deserve a final moment of attention before we move on. Phobos and Deimos, fear and dread, rode always at their father's side, as we have already noted, the dark companions of the battlefield. But Harmonia, their daughter, is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of all. Her very name means harmony, balance, concord. She is the child of war and love, of destruction and beauty, and she became the wife of Cadmus, founder of Thebes, mother of a long and storied lineage. The Greeks, through her, were suggesting something rather profound, that harmony, true harmony, is not born from peace alone or from beauty alone, but from the reconciliation of opposites, from the meeting of Ares and Aphrodite, of the hard and the soft, the fierce and the tender. Something balanced could emerge. Breathe that in for a moment. Let the laughter from Olympus settle. Let the golden net dissolve into metaphor. In our next segment, we turn to a very different theatre of Ares' influence, the earthly city of Sparta, where the god of war was not a figure of awkward comedy or distant fear, but an object of genuine, disciplined, almost devotional reverence. There is a city that exists at the very edge of the Greek imagination, a place so singular in its values, so utterly committed to a particular vision of human life, that even its contemporaries regarded it with a mixture of awe and unease. A city where boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7 and placed into a system of communal training so rigorous, so demanding, so deliberately stripped of comfort and softness, that those who survived it emerged as something the ancient world had rarely seen before, soldiers of almost supernatural discipline and capability. You know this city, it is Sparta, and of all the gods in the Greek pantheon, of all the divine forces the Spartans might have chosen to place at the center of their civic and spiritual life, they chose Ares. This is not a coincidence. It is not simply the obvious choice of a militaristic society reaching for the nearest war god on the shelf. The Spartan relationship with Ares was something far more nuanced, far more deeply considered than that, and to understand it properly, we need to spend some time inside the Spartan worldview, to feel the particular texture of how they thought about war, about the body, about the divine, and about what it meant to live well. Let us begin with the most striking physical symbol of Ares in Sparta. In the center of the city, there stood a statue of the god bound in chains, not triumphant, not mid-battle cry, not posed in the posture of a conqueror, bound, chained, held fast in bronze fetters. To a visitor from another Greek city, this image might have seemed bizarre, even perverse. Why would a warrior culture chain their war god? The answer, when the Spartans gave it, was illuminating. They bound the statue of Ares so that the spirit of war, the energy of battle, the fierce divine force he represented, could never leave Sparta, so that victory, courage, and martial power would remain always within their city's walls, anchored there, unable to wander elsewhere. It was, in its own way, an act not of restraint, but of possession. They were not limiting Ares. They were keeping him, theirs. This speaks to something essential about the Spartan character that often gets flattened in popular imagination. We tend to picture the Spartans as purely physical creatures, all muscle and endurance, operating on instinct and aggression. But the Spartans were, within their own framework, deeply thoughtful about what war meant and what it required. They did not glorify recklessness. They did not celebrate the wild, uncontrolled fury that Ares so often represented in other Greek contexts. What they admired in him, what they sought to cultivate through their worship, was something different, the pure, focused, unwavering commitment to the battlefield that a good soldier must carry within themselves at all times. They wanted the discipline of war, not merely its violence. The agoga, that famous system of Spartan education and military training, was itself a kind of extended ritual in honor of what Ares represented at his best. Boys entering the agoge at 7 were stripped of almost everything: soft bedding, abundant food, the warmth of family, the luxury of privacy. They slept in barracks, trained in all weather, competed constantly against one another in tests of endurance, speed, cunning, and pain tolerance. And this was not cruelty for its own sake, though it certainly sounds harsh to modern ears. It was a considered, deliberate process of transformation. The Spartans believed, with genuine philosophical conviction, that ease and comfort were the enemies of excellence, that the body and will could only be strengthened by being pushed to their limits, and then pushed further still. In submitting their children to this process, they were honoring what they understood to be the essential truth of ARES' domain, that war is not a place for the soft, the comfortable, or the unprepared, and that a city which wishes to survive in a violent world must breed people capable of meeting that violence without flinching. What is particularly fascinating is that the Spartans, for all their fearsome reputation, did not actually worship Ares in the frenzied, bloodthirsty manner one might expect. Their religious practices surrounding him were, by ancient accounts, relatively restrained and formal. They made sacrifices to him before battles, as did most Greek armies, but they also made a point of honoring him afterward, and specifically, they are said to have sacrificed a rooster to Ares following every military victory. The rooster, a bird known for its combative nature and its proud crowing announcement of the dawn, was the Spartan offering of gratitude to their god. It's a detail that has always struck me as quietly beautiful. This compact, fiery little creature brought forward in thanks to the massive, terrible god of war, a small flame offered up to the Great One. There is another layer to the Spartan reverence for Ares that is often overlooked entirely: the role of women in this devotion. Spartan women occupied a remarkably unusual position in the ancient Greek world. Unlike their Athenian counterparts, who lived largely confined to the domestic sphere with very limited public lives, Spartan women were educated, physically trained, encouraged to speak their minds, and expected to manage their households and estates with full competence while their husbands spent the majority of their lives in military service. A Spartan woman was not merely a background figure in the culture of Ares, she was a participant in it. She was expected to be strong enough to bear strong children, composed enough to send her husband and sons to war without visible grief, and proud enough to mean it when she issued the famous injunction that became one of Sparta's most enduring cultural touchstones: "Return with your shield," or on it, "Come home victorious," or "Come home dead." Do not come home having thrown away your shield, the act of a coward who discarded his weapon to run faster. The shield represented not only military equipment but civic honor, and the Spartan woman who said these words was, in her own way, a servant of Ares as devoted as any soldier who carried a spear. This culture produced, of course, the warriors who stood at Thermopylae, that narrow mountain pass where in 480 BCE, a force of Greeks led by 300 Spartans under King Leonidas held back the vast Persian army of Xerxes for 3 days that would echo through history for the next 2.5 millennia. Whether or not you regard Thermopylae as a military victory in any conventional sense, the Spartans who died there died in precisely the manner their entire culture had trained them to aspire to: standing, facing the enemy, without retreat. One almost feels the presence of their chained god in that moment. That anchored, immovable force of Ares held permanently within the Spartan character, unable to depart even in the face of certain death. It is worth noting that Sparta was not entirely without complexity in its divine relationships. Ares was central, yes, but not entirely alone. The Spartans also held Artemis in deep regard, and their worship of her had its own striking and somewhat unsettling dimensions, including rituals involving young men being flogged at her altar, deliberately, ceremonially, as a test of endurance, until blood was drawn. This was not punishment. It was devotion, a ritual designed to honor both the goddess and the Spartan ideal of pain endured without complaint. Even in their worship of the goddess of the hunt and the moon, the Spartans managed to find the martial quality, the test of suffering and silence. That was the foundational note of everything they built. What, then, do we ultimately make of the Spartan Ares, this chained, possessed, domesticated version of the wild god of blood and battle? I think what the Spartans understood, perhaps more clearly than any other Greek society, was that war is not an interruption of ordinary life. It is not an emergency that arrives from outside and then departs, leaving things as they were. War, for the Spartans, was the organizing principle of existence itself, the lens through which everything, childhood, education, marriage, religious practice, even death, was understood and given meaning. And so their Ares was not the chaotic, unreliable, weeping figure who fled from Diomedes' spear. Their Ares was something steadier, something harder and colder and more permanent. He was the divine ratification of everything they had chosen to be. As we leave Sparta behind and move into our next segment, we carry with us a deepened understanding of Ares, not merely as a figure of myth, but as a living cultural force that shaped real cities, real people, real choices made at the edge of swords and shields. The god of war, it turns out, was not the same god in every temple that bore his name. In the segment that follows, we will pull back from the earthly world entirely and look upward, at the cosmic significance of Ares, at his Roman counterpart Mars, and at the remarkable way in which this fierce, flawed, magnificent deity traveled through time, changed his name and his face, and arrived, still recognizable, into the modern world. There is something remarkable that happens to a god when the civilization that created him begins to fade. You might expect the deity to fade with it, to dissolve quietly into the same dust that swallows temples and marble columns and the names of forgotten kings. Sometimes that is exactly what happens, but sometimes something different occurs. Sometimes a god is too essential, too deeply embedded in the human psyche, too perfectly shaped to an enduring truth about the world, to simply disappear. Sometimes a god survives by changing his name. This is the story of what happened to Ares when the Romans rose to dominate the Mediterranean world, absorbing and adapting Greek culture with the systematic efficiency that defined everything they did. They encountered the Greek pantheon and did what practical-minded conquerors often do. They recognized familiar patterns. Zeus became Jupiter, Poseidon became Neptune, Aphrodite became Venus, Hermes became Mercury, and Ares, the god of war, the fierce and flawed deity of the battlefield, became Mars. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because what the Romans did with Mars was not simply a rebranding exercise. They fundamentally transformed him, elevated him, dignified him, and placed him at the very heart of their national identity in a way the Greeks had never quite managed with Ares. In Greece, as we have explored at length across these segments, Ares occupied an uncomfortable position. Powerful, yes. Necessary, certainly. But also distrusted, mocked, wounded, imprisoned, put on trial, and regarded even by his own divine father with barely concealed disdain. He was the god the Greeks could not entirely do without, but could never quite bring themselves to fully embrace. He was, in many ways, the embarrassing relative at the divine table, tolerated, kept at a careful distance, never quite celebrated. Mars, in Rome, was something entirely different. He was the second most important deity in the entire Roman pantheon, surpassed only by Jupiter himself. He was not regarded with ambivalence or unease. He was honored with genuine, deep civic pride, because the Romans had built their mythology around a story that made Mars not merely a war god, but a founding father. According to Roman tradition, Mars was the father of Romulus and Remus, those famous twin brothers who, abandoned as infants and suckled by a she-wolf, would go on to found the city of Rome itself. Through this single mythological connection, Mars became something Ares never was, the divine ancestor of an entire civilization. Every Roman citizen could trace their city, their identity, their very existence back to the son of Mars. To honor Mars was not merely to acknowledge war's necessity. It was to honor the origin of everything. This distinction tells us something profound about the difference in character between Greek and Roman civilization. The Greeks, for all their military accomplishments, were ultimately a culture that prized the individual intellect, the philosophical debate, the contest of ideas as much as the contest of arms. War, in the Greek imagination, was one human activity among many, and not necessarily the noblest one. The Romans, by contrast, were builders of empire, administrators of vast conquered territories, engineers of roads and aqueducts and legal systems designed to bind the known world into a single functioning entity. And empire requires war, not occasionally, not reluctantly, but constantly, systematically, as a matter of civic purpose. Rome needed a war god it could be proud of. Rome needed a Mars, not an Ares, and so the month of March was named for him. The month that traditionally marked the beginning of the military campaigning season, when the snows retreated and the roads became passable and Roman legions could once again move. The field outside Rome where soldiers trained and armies mustered was called the Campus Martius, the field of Mars. A vast open space that would eventually host not just military exercises but public assemblies, elections, and civic gatherings. The field of war bleeding seamlessly into the field of politics and public life. Even the planet that ancient astronomers observed moving across the sky with its distinctive reddish hue, red, the color of blood, of fire, of the crest on a soldier's helmet, was named Mars. And so it remains today. When modern astronomers train their instruments on the fourth planet from the sun, when scientists design rovers to travel its rust-colored surface, when nations debate whether human beings will one day walk its barren landscape, they are invoking, however unconsciously, the name of the Roman god of war, who was himself the heir of the Greek god of war, who was himself born of Zeus and Hera in the charged and conflicted atmosphere of Olympus. The chain of inheritance runs unbroken from that ancient nursery all the way to a spacecraft drifting through the modern cosmos. Let us linger for a moment on that reddish planet, because it is one of the most visible and enduring marks Ares and Mars have left upon our world. The planet Mars has been known by its name since antiquity, its color connecting it in the ancient mind immediately to blood and battle. And our connection to it is not merely nominal. The month, the planet, the field, the name, these are everywhere, hiding in plain sight. The word martial, meaning warlike or relating to combat, descends directly from Mars. When we speak of martial arts, martial law, or the martial spirit of a fighting force, we are speaking a language shaped by this ancient deity. The word martial music, the kind played at military ceremonies and parades, carries the god's name in every note. He is embedded in language, the way old roots are embedded in soil, invisible from the surface, but holding everything together underneath. Beyond language, the image of Ares and Mars has traveled through 2.5 millennia of Western art, emerging in painting after painting, sculpture after sculpture, as artists across the centuries return to this figure to explore ideas about war, power, masculinity, and the relationship between violence and civilization. Botticelli painted him asleep, exhausted, disarmed and softened in the presence of Venus' love's triumph over war, rendered in luminous Italian light. Velasquez painted Mars seated and brooding, his martial armor laid aside, his expression not triumphant but tired and somewhat melancholy, a soldier at rest who carries the weight of everything he has seen. Jacques-Louis David, painting in revolutionary France, invoked the language of Mars again and again to give heroic shape to the violence of his own turbulent moment. In each case, artists found in this ancient figure a vocabulary for something they could not quite express in ordinary human terms. The strange coexistence of glory and horror that war has always carried within it. The legacy of Ares also flows through literature in ways too numerous to fully catalogue. But a few deserve particular mention. John Milton, in Paradise Lost, draws on the imagery of the war god in his depiction of Satan's rebellion against heaven, a cosmic war with all the chaotic fury of Ares at its center. Shakespeare's most martial figures, Coriolanus, Othello, Hotspur, carry recognizable traces of the Ares archetype, brave to the point of recklessness, powerful beyond ordinary measure, and undone ultimately by the very qualities that make them extraordinary. The Ares pattern, immense capability compromised by pride, rage, and the inability to submit to wisdom's restraint, is one of the most durable templates in all of storytelling, because it maps so precisely onto a truth about human nature that does not age. In our own time, Ares has enjoyed a remarkable cultural resurgence. He appears as a character in films, television series, novels, and video games with a frequency that would have surprised perhaps even the ancient Greeks. The God of War video game franchise, which has introduced millions of modern players to the world of Greek mythology through the story of Kratos himself, a figure with deep roots in the Ares mythology, has become one of the most critically celebrated and widely discussed artistic treatments of these ancient stories in any medium. That a video game exploring the themes of divine conflict, paternal rage, and the burden of violence has reached audiences in the tens of millions across the globe speaks to the enduring, almost irresistible pull of these stories. We have never stopped needing a god of war. We have never stopped finding, in that figure, a mirror held up to something we recognize and cannot quite name in ourselves. What is perhaps most extraordinary about the legacy of Ares, when we step back far enough to take in its full shape, is this: he was never the most loved god, never the most celebrated, never the most widely worshipped across the breadth of the Greek world, never the one to whom poets devoted their most tender hymns or architects their most elegant temples. And yet he has outlasted nearly all of them in the popular imagination. Athena is respected, Apollo admired, Aphrodite desired. But Ares is felt. He lives in the red planet above our heads, in the martial drumbeat of ceremonial music, in the word we reach for when we want to describe something that carries the weight of war. He is, in the end, the god we cannot put down, because what he represents cannot be put down. Violence, conflict, the fierce and terrible energy of battle. These are not aberrations in human history. They are woven into it, as indelibly as anything else. Breathe slowly. Let that settle without alarm, because in our final segment, we will bring all of these threads together. The myths, the Spartans, the Romans, the artists, the planets, and the words. And ask the question that has been waiting quietly beneath everything we have explored. What does Ares ultimately mean? Not for the ancient Greeks, not for the Romans, but for us. Here, now, in this present moment. We're almost home. Let us make this final journey together. We have traveled a long way together, through the charged atmosphere of Olympus, across the dusty plains of Troy into the austere barracks of Sparta, through the scandal of a golden net and the laughter of gods, across centuries of art and language and the rust-colored surface of a distant planet. And now, in this final segment, we slow down even further. We arrive somewhere quieter. We sit with the question that all of this has been building toward. What does Ares mean to us now? Not as a theological proposition. Most of us do not worship him, do not leave roosters at his altar or pray to him before battle, but as a mirror, as a symbol, as a story the human race has been telling itself, in one form or another, for as long as it has known how to tell stories at all. Here is what I believe, having spent this time walking through his world. Ares endures not because war is glorious, The Greeks themselves were careful never to make that simple, dangerous argument, but because war is real, because conflict is real, because the dark, surging energy that Ares embodies is something every human being carries within them to some degree, whether they have ever seen a battlefield or not. The capacity for violence, for rage, for the overwhelming, consuming fury that can rise in a person when something they love is threatened. This is not a flaw inserted into the human design. It is part of the design itself. And the Greeks, with their characteristic honesty about human nature, gave that part of the design a face, a name, a family, and a story. This is what mythology, at its deepest, most essential level, actually does. It does not explain the world in the way that science explains it. It does not legislate behavior the way that law does. What it does, quietly and persistently across thousands of years, is acknowledge the full complexity of human experience without flinching from the uncomfortable parts. Ares is the uncomfortable part. He is the chapter in the human story that we might prefer not to read, that we might close the book on if we could, and yet he keeps appearing in our history, in our politics, in our psychology, in our art. He keeps insisting on being seen, and perhaps this is the most important thing the myth of Ares offers us, not permission to embrace violence, but permission to acknowledge it honestly. The Greeks did not worship Ares because they wanted war. They gave him a place in their pantheon because they understood that pretending he did not exist, pretending that the impulse toward violence was not a genuine and powerful part of human experience, was its own kind of dangerous fantasy. Better to name it, better to give it a temple, a ritual, a chain of bronze around its ankle to keep it from wandering entirely unchecked. Better to look directly at the thing and understand it, than to look away and be surprised when it finds you anyway. There is also, threaded through everything we have explored, a quieter and more tender truth about Ares that I want to leave you with. For all his ferocity, for all his wounds and humiliations and the contempt of his own father, Ares never stopped. He never retreated into bitterness or ceased to be what he was. He was injured on the battlefield of Troy, and he returned to battle. He was imprisoned in a bronze jar for 13 months, and he walked free and was himself again. He was laughed at by every god on Olympus, and he loved Aphrodite still. He was acquitted at trial, and he went on being a father, being a warrior, being precisely and unapologetically the force of nature he had always been. There is something almost admirable in that stubbornness, something that speaks not to recklessness but to a kind of fidelity, a commitment to one's own nature, however uncomfortable that nature might make the world around you. The Greeks were not suggesting we emulate Ares in his violence. They were observing, with characteristic nuance, that authenticity, however raw, however difficult, has its own strange dignity. We live today in a world that has not moved beyond Ares. We have better tools, faster communications, more sophisticated languages for discussing conflict and its costs. But the fundamental human struggle that Ares represents, the tension between the impulse toward violence and the aspiration toward wisdom, between the Ares within us and the Athena we hope to become, is as present and as urgent now as it was on the plains of Troy 3,000 years ago. Every generation must meet this tension freshly, must decide again what to do with the force of it, must choose, in whatever form the choice presents itself, between the spear raised in fury and the shield raised in thought. The ancient Greeks could not resolve this tension, neither can we, but they gave us something invaluable in the attempt, a story, beautifully structured, honestly told, that holds the full weight of the question without pretending there is an easy answer at the bottom of it. And so we come to rest here, at the end of our journey, in the presence of a God who was never quite loved, never quite trusted, never quite tamed, and who remains, for precisely those reasons, one of the most truthful figures the human imagination has ever produced. Somewhere, if the ancient stories are to be believed, he is still there, still moving between the ranks, still felt in the pit of the stomach on those mornings when the world feels dangerous and the air carries a charge that cannot quite be named, still waiting, patient as a war god can be patient, for the next time a human being reaches, however reluctantly, for the sword. Let your breathing slow now. Let the sound of ancient battlefields fade into stillness. The story of ARES, wild, flawed, enduring, and achingly human, is told, and it is enough.